Tēnā koutou katoa and hello from Lower Hutt in Wellington. My name's Sarah Bell and I'm a project lead and senior researcher at the Helen Clark Foundation. Welcome to today's webinar entitled What Becomes of the Broken-Hearted? The Future of Trade in a Fragmented World. A particular welcome to the many new members who've joined the Foundation over the last couple of months, and also to anyone who's joining one of our webinars for the first time today. For those who are interested in supporting our Foundation's mission of developing long-term solutions to New Zealand's many challenges, we'd love to have you as a member. You can join us on our website or through the link that my colleague Victoria will post in the chat. Before we jump into today's webinar, we've got an exciting range of webinars planned in the coming weeks. You may already have seen details of next week's webinar convened by our Honorary Senior Fellow Jonathan Boston on future generations. We're lucky to have international expert Jacob Ellis join us to share his insights for that, and to have leading voices Sophie Hanford and Simon Upton providing some New Zealand context. That webinar is at 12 p.m. New Zealand time on the 9th of October, and you can register for that now. In November, we'll also have webinars on issues as broad as junk food and obesity, on keeping young people safe from online harm, and on infrastructure for an ageing population. So keep an eye on your inboxes for updates and registration links for those. On to some housekeeping for today. A reminder that this is a webinar, not a normal Zoom call, so your cameras and microphones are deactivated throughout, and you're safe to eat your lunch and drink your coffee. We won't be able to see or hear you. We do hope you'll participate in the conversation though by submitting questions for our panelists in Zoom's Q&A function, which you can access at the bottom of your screen. You can do that whenever a question occurs to you throughout the webinar, and Stephen will pose those to our guests from around 1:40 p.m. You can see there's a separate chat function where Victoria's posting links, but please submit your questions in the Q&A area rather than in the chat. And finally, please let us know what you thought of today's webinar by filling out the feedback form that should appear in your browser and also in your inbox afterwards. And that helps us to design webinars that you want to see in future. So this is the first time I've hosted one of our Foundation webinars, and I'm very pleased to be starting this one for two reasons. The first is that it's the first webinar convened and moderated by one of our newly minted Honorary Senior Fellows, Stephen Jacobi. And the second, that it's on the topic of the international trading system, a sphere in which I spent a large part of my career before joining the Foundation, and a hugely important subject for anyone who's thinking about New Zealand's current and future prosperity. New Zealand's played a key role over the last few decades in building and maintaining the rules-based international trading system that makes sure that we have a fair and level playing field for big and small countries as we trade goods and services. That system's now under huge pressure, and we're fortunate to be joined today by experts from around the Asia-Pacific region to talk about what's happening and, more importantly, how we can respond. Today's discussion will be led by Stephen Jacobi, one of our Honorary Senior Fellows and someone who spent his career in service of New Zealand's role in the international trading system. Stephen currently serves as New Zealand's Director for the Australia-New Zealand Leadership Forum. He's a former diplomat and a trade official who's served in various capacities, including having led both the NZ-US and NZ-China councils, as well as the APEC Business Advisory Council. Stephen serves as Managing Director of Jacobi Consulting Limited and was until recently Executive Director of the New Zealand International Business Forum. He's a frequent media and public commentator on industry, trade and international issues, and we're thrilled to now have Stephen as part of the Helen Clark Foundation whānau. I'll hand over now to Stephen to introduce our panellists.
Kia ora tātou, inga mana, inga reo, inga hawe whā, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you very much indeed, Sarah, and thank you to the Helen Clark Foundation for bringing us all together, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. What becomes of the broken-hearted? That is a song from the 60s by Jimmy Ruffin. It has a sort of, well, unlikely or likely relevance to when we're considering the future of the international trading system in what we describe as a fragmented or fragmenting world. Fragmenting because the international trading system and the rules which for 30 years or more have tied it together are today under threat. Waves of new tariffs have been introduced in the United States once the champion of free trade. Dodgy deals are being done by US trading partners. We're observing a general decline in what was once a consensus about international trade. Broken-hearted because some of us who've worked in the system over the last period find it hard to recognize where we've got to in a short period of time. Broken-hearted because we would like to see things be better. But don't despair, everyone. All is not lost, or at least we hope it's not lost. And today we brought together a panel of highly qualified experts who can help us explore perhaps a new way of moving forward. And let me introduce our panelists to you. They're all good friends of mine and recognized trade experts. Firstly, delighted to see my friend Dr. Deborah Elms, who joins us today from the Heinrich Foundation in Singapore, where she is head of trade policy, and earlier established the Asian Trade Center. Deborah is a regular commentator on trade policy in the region, one of the internationally recognized experts in this field. She has a PhD in political science from the University of Washington. She has written numerous articles, edited books. She's always on TV and radio talking about trade, including here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. She's regularly quoted in newspapers and magazines around the world. Deborah, delighted to see you. Thank you very much for making the time available early in the morning in Singapore. Kia ora. And can I also introduce my friend Philip Turner, who's had a career divided between business and diplomacy. He's spent over 20 years working in Japan, Korea, in China. From 2018 to 2023, he served as New Zealand's ambassador to South Korea, based in Seoul. Prior to that, he spent 18 years in senior roles with New Zealand's largest company and exporter, the Fonterra Cooperative Group. He was president of Fonterra in China, based in Shanghai, between 2009 and 2013. He earlier had a diplomatic career. He's now based in Tokyo, balances consulting, writing, teaching, and study, and enjoys all that wonderful country of Japan has to offer. Philip, kia ora hoa, nice to have you with us. And thirdly, Devon Whittle, a friend of mine from Canberra, a former Australian trade negotiator and lawyer who worked for over 7 years in Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And during that time, Devon negotiated a number of bilateral, plurilateral, multilateral deals. And by the way, all that jargon you're going to get used to in this webinar, but we'll all be very careful to explain what we're talking about. Now, Devon leads the Australian office of a non-profit policy advocacy organisation focused, would you believe, on global catastrophic risk. Seems very relevant, Devon, for today's discussion. And you are a regular commentator on social media on trade policy, and I enjoy your various contributions. Kia ora, ika, ihika. Great to have you two with us. So let's get started and jump into today's topic. I'd like to start off firstly by thinking about why trade is important and finding out a bit more about how these current challenges I've described are impacting. I want to go to Philip first of all, if I may, and ask, or rather observe that it's been a heady few months for trade, to say the least. And as a result, there is considerable confusion in the marketplace. But before we get into the detail of those developments, Philip, you've worked in government and business. Can you explain for us why we should care about what is happening with trade right now? And how has New Zealand, along with other partners of ours, benefited from what we describe as an open international trading system?
Kia ora, Stephen. Thank you for the intro, and thanks for everyone for the opportunity to be here. Look, clearly, New Zealand's economic performance, that's to say our standard of living, depends enormously on trade. As Helen Clark has said, trade is the lifeblood of the economy. Income from trade provides the revenue that enables us to enjoy the quality of life that we have. It underpins our jobs, our incomes, as well as the government's ability to provide services such as social welfare or education or defence. New Zealand is simply too small a country to sustain a high standard of living on our own. We have 680,000 people, that's 1 in 4 jobs, who depend on trade directly for their livelihood. And that income, in turn, creates the base for the rest of the economy. That ability to trade, particularly in agricultural products, made New Zealand one of the richest countries in the world, at least until the 1950s. But that dependence on a few major products, of course, creates vulnerability as well as opportunities. So in the 1970s and 80s, we saw some of those vulnerabilities. We went through major trade shocks. The UK joined the European Union. Then we had the oil price shocks. These created huge challenges for our economy and made us relatively poorer. In the last 30 years, however, since the 1990s, we've had golden weather in trade, steadily increasing access to other markets. This came as a result of multilateral trade negotiations through the World Trade Organization, as well as smaller trade agreements with the likes of China, ASEAN, Europe, and many others. Now, the benefits of these agreements are readily apparent. We can see it in the growth in trade. You only have to look at the statistics, for example, on how trade has grown since we signed the FTA with China or with the European Union. And let me give you a specific example from Fonterra, where I worked for 18 years. In the latest results that were published just this month, Fonterra reports that its total income, that's to say, the combination of the milk price paid to farmers plus Fonterra's profit over that, came to $16 billion. Now that's 4% of New Zealand's total GDP and about the same size as our entire education budget. Now, once again, as Stephen has indicated, the trade environment in the world has turned bad. Vangelis Vitalis, our top trade negotiator, is fond of saying that we have seen the end of the golden weather. We're now into cloud and rain. And this is principally because the big players, particularly the United States, and to a lesser extent China, are threatening the global trading system. There's been lots of attention on President Trump's tariffs. Now, we'll hear more about this. They're probably illegal under both US law and international trade law. But more importantly, they are highly damaging to the United States' economy and to everybody else. But we're also seeing bad behavior by China and others. Over the last few years, we saw China use economic coercion, frankly, bullying of Australia and of South Korea. The same could happen to New Zealand. Furthermore, its desire for growth means that China is now flooding the world with low-cost manufactured products, everything from electric cars to solar panels. Now, that's good for consumers, including in New Zealand, but it is putting a huge strain on other big manufacturing economies, such as Japan, Korea, and the United States. So bad behavior by the big countries is threatening the whole trading system. Both the WTO and smaller free trade agreements are being ignored or torn up, particularly by the US. Tariffs are rising, making it harder and more expensive to trade. Smaller countries are likely to feel more pain than bigger ones, but for everybody, the system's in crisis. So I'll stop there, Stephen. Thanks.
Thank you, Philip. Trade is our lifeblood, and maybe milk is part of that too, at least for New Zealand. But I think you described very well, what's at stake for New Zealand in the current situation. Deborah, I would like to turn to you. From your vantage point at the Heinrich Foundation in Singapore, you have been tracking the changes we're seeing in the United States and around the world. The changes have been far-reaching, contradictory at times, downright confusing for everybody. What do you see as the main real-world impact of this rising new protectionism? Are these developments temporary, long-standing, or is this tariff disease catchy?
Those are some great questions. Thank you very much. I think there's a couple of things happening. So from the United States in particular, these tariff challenges are new. They are contradictory. They do change literally by the minute. Donald Trump, the US president, is addicted to tariffs. He loves them, and he is not going to stop using them for as long as he sits in the Oval Office. So if you're looking at US policy, I would say expect tariffs from now until he leaves office. And then once he leaves office, they don't go away. You know, once you've got that tariff revenue coming in, even though it's on the back of American companies and American consumers, basically acting as an indirect tax, that revenue is very attractive. And it's running currently at $30 billion per month. And that is looking very attractive to a country that is highly indebted. And so I don't think even after Trump leaves that the US will revert to having a low tariff environment. So pre-Trump, just to give you some sense of what we're looking at, pre-Trump in December, tariffs into the United States were roughly 2%. Currently, they are on track to be almost 19% and rising rapidly as more and more of the US economy comes under, especially sector-specific tariffs, which are much higher than the current batch of what we're calling reciprocal, although there's no reciprocalness about them. They're basically unilateral tariffs imposed against everyone else. So the numbers are bad and rising, and the damage to the US economy is growing. But just to be clear, because I get this question all the time, the damage to the US economy is perhaps not as striking as it would be if any other country tried to do this, because the US is relatively trade independent. Almost all of the US economy is domestically driven, especially services trade, and only 30% of the US economy is trade related. Now that is quite different from New Zealand and lots of other trade exposed places in Asia. I mean, I sit in Singapore where we have our trade to GDP ratio is actually 300%, not 30, 300%. So if the Singaporeans decided for whatever reason to do this nonsense, it would be catastrophic, and it would be catastrophic domestically in seconds. It wouldn't take any time at all. So this is a long-standing problem we're going to have out of the United States. Fortunately, I would argue most of the rest of the world has been innocent bystanders to the damage and destruction, but they have not yet largely moved to respond with similar moves against especially other countries. In fact, we see the opposite. We see a lot of countries, especially driven by New Zealand, to try to be more integrated, to sign more trade agreements, to provide better stability, low risk, more certainty as a result of different kinds of bilateral agreements, regional agreements, even some crazy new ideas in the global arena. And so I think that shows you the sort of disconnect that we have between unilateral protectionist actions and increasing integration actions from countries that recognize the damage. And my last point that I will make before I close this round, at least, is to say that this level of disruption is unprecedented. I'm sure in the lives of all of us on this call, in our professional existence, we have grown used to a certain set of working environment. That is gone. And it is very unsettling. It is very disturbing. It is professionally disturbing. It's personally disturbing, but it's professionally disturbing. And the challenge that I think most of us are grappling with, especially in the business and government spaces, is where do we go from here? Once you have sort of smashed the existing set of global rules and the landscape that you're used to operating in, it's not going to be fast or easy to bring it. We're not bringing it back, just to be clear. That's done. We're not going back to the way things were in December. We don't know where we're headed yet. And it's going to take us longer than people would like to think to get to whatever the new normal might be. And so there's no surprise to me that we get crazy numbers of people who want to join webinars on trade issues because it matters to all of us. And it's very, very unusual to have this kind of disruption absent like a global war, actually. And so here we are 80 years later trying to sort of slowly make our way through the rubble to figure out what does come after this. And so just as a reassurance to everybody on the call, it's bad. It's been bad. It will stay bad for quite some time. But there are some glimmers of hope out there. And the unsettled feeling that you've got is a sensible and natural reaction to the level of change.
Thank you, Deborah. Well, we're not going back, as you said, and we have a right to feel at least a little bit, perhaps more than a little bit brokenhearted about what has happened. But there are some glimmers of hope. So that was actually quite a reassuring note in what you had to say. I want to turn to Devon now. Devon, you've been a trade negotiator. You've worked in the inside of this system. Perhaps you could tell us, how's this worked in the past? And what do you see as being really different now?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen, and thank you to the Helen Clark Foundation for inviting me. It's really great to be part of this discussion with Philip and Deborah and yourself. And I think that there are a number of ways you can cut that sort of question in terms of how we did things in the past and what's happening now. I'll try to keep it at a relatively high level so we don't get into those acronyms and technical terms too much. But basically, when I was a trade negotiator and we'd look at doing a new FTA with the country, there were sort of three key elements, I think, in my mind. First, what are the barriers that Australian businesses are facing in our foreign market that we're going to negotiate with? What are the barriers Australia has that we might need to be pushed to remove as part of the negotiation? And then what's the overall deal going to look like that's going to trade off pain on both sides and benefits on both sides? And then from that analysis and discussion, we'd usually end up with a legally binding text, a comprehensive agreement that covers goods, services, investment, IP. It lets people find the benefits in the areas they need and trade those off on the pain points that they have to give up. And importantly, attached to those texts was dispute settlement, so mandatory dispute settlement. We can go to an independent third party if we think the other side's in breach. And then also, and this is actually a really key point, is as a trade negotiator for Australia, it was really drummed into me that these agreements are meant to be mutually beneficial, right? Both sides are going to benefit from the sort of liberalisation and commitments we're entering into. And in fact, if it's not mutually beneficial, then the agreement won't be a sustainable one into the future because you're going to have defections on either side when people start realising, actually, this wasn't working for us. So that's the traditional approach. And I think, that stood us up very well. Australia has a number of FTAs that followed that model and had binding legal text as a result. If we move to what Trump 2.0 is doing, I think it's radically different, right? And I think Deborah's already hinted at some of this, the so-called Turnberry approach, which is the language that USTR Greer has been using to describe this new vision of trade. The first thing I'd say is that it frames these negotiations as very zero-sum, right? So a trade deal in the Trump 2.0 administration is about extracting benefit from the counterparty rather than seeing this as a mutually beneficial enterprise that they're entering into. The second thing that I would highlight is that we aren't seeing legally binding text. I think Deborah's called these deals napkin deals, given how ephemeral they are. Sometimes just by a tweet or by a US announcement, you'll see a deal's been announced or been sent out to the other party. And the third element is that the US doesn't want dispute settlement. Dispute settlement was a unique development, I think, for the US in the international system generally. The fact that they accepted this in the WTO and other places for trade was a novel innovation. But now they've decided, no, the way we're going to enforce these deals is through unilateral measures on the US side. So if the US thinks you're not complying with your trade deal, you can expect them to just impose tariffs without giving a third-party process to really determine whether the breach is there or not. And so then the other elements I think that are also quite interesting with these new US deals is they're not comprehensive. So as I said, with the past approaches, we'd cover the full spectrum of issues. With the US deals, we're seeing very targeted tariff commitments. We're seeing non-market-based commitments on things like investment, $1 trillion investment commitments from Japan, but none of that broader comprehensive deal. And then the final thing maybe that I'll say is that we are seeing the integration, the explicit integration of non-trade issues into these deals. So particularly around security interests, relationships with the US's primary rivals. That's always been the underlying current of trade. Trade has never been divorced from foreign policy. But I think in more recent years, we've seen across the board a greater integration of those national security and geopolitical issues into these trade negotiations.
Well, thank you, Devon. I think you've really spoken to the changes that we're seeing, and in the words of Yogi Berra, that American baseball player, the future definitely ain't what it used to be. We're in a different world today, and let's focus now on how these changes are being perceived in parts of the world. I mean, we're really delighted to be joined by colleagues today from, not Australia, but Singapore, and also in Tokyo. Gives us a good opportunity to review what's happening in our own region. Just to note that here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, there is, as Deborah has noted, keen public interest in these developments. And I notice we have over 200 online at the moment, and we had, another 100 more who registered, and we'll look at this video doubtless later on. Back in April, the United States imposed a 10% tariff on New Zealand, an additional tariff, by the way. This was raised to 15% in August. Our problem seems to be a small trade surplus we have with the United States. Australia is being treated a little better than us. It only has a 10% tariff, but gets no benefit for the large trade deficit it has with the United States, the large trade surplus the United States has with Australia. Others have been treated more favorably than us, and others have been treated, even less well than us. So look, our exports to the United States in the last quarter are dropped by 3%. Exports to the rest of the world rose by 11%, but that was before the 15% tariff was imposed. So the jury's still out. But we're not seeking to negotiate with the United States. We're examining what is happening. We're engaging closely with others. Just recently, we were part of a small group of smaller economic nations that's been established to think about the future of trade. But let me ask you all how the impact is being felt in your economies and how your governments are reacting. Let me go back to you, Devon, to find out what's happening in Australia.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. And as you said, the US runs a trade surplus with Australia, so we import more from the US than they import from us. So in fact, the last numbers in 2024 is around $27 billion trade surplus that the US runs with us. So you'd think that we could have escaped the extra tariffs, the so-called reciprocal tariffs that Deborah referred to. And in fact, we also have an FTA with the US, a very high quality FTA, in fact, which took a lot of political capital to deliver when it was done. And yet we still didn't escape these tariffs. So we still got hit by 10% baseline tariffs. Yes, it was lowest on offer, but still our Prime Minister described this as not the actions of a friend. And in addition to those baseline tariffs, some of our key sectors were hit with those sector-specific tariffs, steel, aluminum, copper, and even pharmaceuticals last week. There's suggestions that may hit Australian exporters as well. And in fact, beyond the tariffs that applied directly to Australia, we also saw things like the de minimis thresholds getting removed, which basically means that the US used to exempt certain packages under a certain value from having to pay customs duties. That's been removed, and that resulted in all package shipments from Australia post to the US being halted for a brief period. And so we're seeing very direct impacts from those sort of non-tariff measures being applied even to Australia. In terms of the impact that's had on our economy, actually the modelling suggests Australia doesn't need to be too worried at the moment around these US tariffs for our economy. Indeed, some of our sectors, given the low baseline that we have, may turn out to have an advantage compared to other countries. And we have a relatively diversified trade profile in terms of the markets we export to. So China, for example, is a major export market, obviously, for us. And we also have a export profile dominated by raw minerals and resources, where we're a very low-cost producer. So in fact, I think for Australia, one of the bigger concerns may be the broader slowing of global growth that these tariffs may have, and in fact, the impact they'll have on our key markets in the region, so particularly China, Vietnam, and others in ASEAN, where obviously the fact that the US is imposing tariffs on those producers will then have flow-on effects to what they're going to import from us. But again, the modelling for Australia is quite mixed. So at the moment, the direct impact for Australia shouldn't be too significant or severe, but obviously it's not a good look for our region or for the general global economy. And in terms of how our government's responded, I think, as I said, the PM first labelled this as not an act of a friend. He suggested that all options are on the table, including dispute settlement. But since that early time, it's been sort of a backing off and an attempt to keep a bit of a low profile in terms of the US's gaze around the region. And so instead, the concrete responses on the Australian side have been really about domestic support for people impacted by these tariffs. Australia is cutting around 500 nuisance tariffs that we still have in place. And we're pushing on with FTA negotiations. So the EU Commissioner will be here, I think, later this month, hoping to reignite that negotiation. Indian negotiations continue on. And so we're seeing really a deliberate attempt to say, okay, the US has imposed its tariffs. What can we do in Australia to keep liberalising markets, finding new markets, and protecting the rules-based system, at least in our region, rather than trying to directly retaliate or attack against what the US is doing.
Thank you, Devon. Deborah, turning to you, Singapore, our great, friend, that is to say, of New Zealand, indeed of all of us, but also more widely in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, so Singapore, like Australia, has a 10% tariff. And as a result of that, Singapore is, like Australia, ducking under the table and hoping that the United States doesn't even notice that they exist. I mean, I think that's part of the challenge that we're having here, is that we have these differential impacts of these tariffs, where even within Southeast Asia, tariffs range from 40% now against Laos and Myanmar. Most of ASEAN is sitting at 19 or 20%, and Singapore sitting at 10%. And so it's been challenging for governments to actually coordinate because the impact is differential. First of all, the direct impact is differential, but even if you dig down a bit and you say, well, how are we affected by this? Some countries like Cambodia, which appear to be badly hit by a 19% tariff, it's a very trade exposed country. It exports a tremendous amount, especially of clothing and luggage and so forth, to the United States directly, appears to be in rough shape given all of this tariff disruption. But there's a couple of sort of wrinkles that make this complicated. One is that although Cambodia's tariffs are bad, other people in similar sectors are actually worse, which means that in a relative basis, Cambodia, even sitting at 19%, is actually doing better than the competitors. So that makes the impact, which is not great, just to be clear. I'm not suggesting tariffs are a good thing. Let's not do them. But the impact is not quite as bad as it might first appear relative to others for Cambodia. And it also leads to, again, these sort of peculiar outcomes where we have differential impacts across the Southeast Asian region. That has made it even more challenging than ever to cooperate as a bloc to deal with the US in particular, but also to the disruption to the global trading environment. And so, that's been a puzzle. In fact, my article today that comes out today from the Heinrich Foundation is precisely on why has it been so difficult for governments to coordinate. Part of it is this differential tariff impact, and we have this WYSI graphic coming out. So I urge all of you, if you're not a subscriber to us, it's free, please do so. But the WYSI graphic is kind of interesting. We've used the data from the Global Trade Alert, which has been doing an interesting job sort of saying, let's look at the actual impact on the ground of these different tariffs, to give some new sort of insights into this. The net result of that, of course, is that it's better than it could have been, but it's still bad. And so Singapore, like New Zealand, like Australia, has been looking for alternatives. Both of them are part, as you mentioned, Stephen, of this future of investment and trade partnership, FITP, which please, the people on this line, let us get a better acronym for this thing. I think it's interesting because it's a really, well, especially this one, goodness gracious, let's get rid of this. It's 14 countries at the moment who are really looking for unique ways for small size players to have an impact. And I think that is to be championed at this moment. And in particular, especially for businesses who happen to be on the line, I would say the FITP countries it's brand new. In fact, we get the formal launch in November. So that's how new this whole exercise is. But what I think is great about it is they're looking for ideas about what can these different groups of countries do. And that has unlocked, in my view, some unique opportunities for businesses and for governments to think a bit differently. If the world is disrupted, then you can do things that you otherwise would never have been able to consider. And so I would urge folks on this call in particular to say, well, let's start thinking about what could we do? What would we like to see that we haven't been able to see? What are the kinds of initiatives that could be pushed forward? Especially concrete, tangible things of real benefit to businesses. I think that's worth celebrating, even in the face of all of this disruption and chaos that we face globally.
Thank you for that. Deborah, Philip, how about things in Tokyo and maybe Korea?
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. I think the impact in North Asia, I would describe as likely to range from moderately bad to bad. But to be fair, I think the impact to date has been variable, kind of as Deborah has indicated, and the results have only partly landed. It's kind of too early to tell. In both Korea and Japan, the governments have been taking a similar approach. Like others, not retaliating, They've been trying to reduce the US tariffs through negotiation, and they've been looking to support local industry and consumers through packages of support, such as tax cuts, cash handouts, subsidies, and so on. But there's no doubt that Japan and Korea feel they have their backs to the wall. Now, Japan's gone ahead and done a deal. It's got the US to agree to 50% quote reciprocal tariffs, which is better than the 25% that was initially threatened. In return, Japan has had to commit to a massive but vague long-term deal whereby it is said that, or the US claims that, Japan is going to provide $550 billion in investment in the US. Now, this deal is crazy. It's massively biased to the US, ridiculously expensive for Japan, but it's unlikely, in my view, to ever happen. And what I suspect that's happened is that Japan has traded some short-term certainty around the 15% tariffs in return for long-term risk and uncertainty, on the basis that with President Trump, nothing is ever likely to stay that way for long. And for now, of course, it meets the test of something that Trump can claim back home as a win. So in Japan, I think the impact is varying by sector. So far in sectors like automobiles, I think we've seen relatively stable export prices, but volumes have fallen, which suggests that Japanese exporters so far are taking some of the pain. It's not clear that they will continue to do so. I think the likes of Toyota, who have a huge manufacturing capacity inside the US, will be able to cope. They've got global portfolios. But for small to medium enterprises and those at the bottom of the export chain, I think life is much tougher. I think automobiles are a bit special in the sense that the Japanese manufacturers so far have chosen the hybrid route rather than electric vehicles. And so far, they're doing very well. Now, so far, the US is helping them by not allowing or by largely blocking BYD and Chinese exports to come into the US. If the US were to allow BYD into their market, I think that could be very dangerous for the Japanese manufacturers. Also, I think the currencies are making a difference. The low yen, the high dollar provides a bit of a cushion still for exporters out of Japan. But nonetheless, as elsewhere, and as others have said, I think the Japanese are furious that they've even had to do a deal at all. There is no upside in this deal for them. The tariffs were previously very low. They're already the largest investor in the United States, one of the US's most reliable security partners. They're thinking, what more can we do? And of course, then you look across to Korea, and the Koreans, I think, are in an even worse situation and having to deal with semiconductors and chips as well as cars. Korea has tried to do the same kind of deal, or was trying to do a similar deal to Japan, but hasn't got there yet. They're in a tougher situation. They've got less investment in the US, smaller foreign reserves, and they're feeling pretty angry about the incident last week where 300 Koreans were expelled from a Hyundai plant in the United States. So Korea has an informal agreement, a handshake. Maybe that's a napkin deal, as they said, with US around 15%. But the US is pushing for $350 billion of investment, and Korea this week has just come out and said, we cannot do that. So both countries are following the same strategy of negotiate, don't retaliate, and seek to mitigate the damage to the local economy and supporting consumers. So it's a pretty grim outlook in North Asia, Stephen.
You know, what's coming through from this conversation is the differing nature of the tariffs and the way they impact on differing trading partners, which gives rise to some unusual situations such as the ones that Deborah talked about vis-a-vis Cambodia and others in Southeast Asia, or very severe outcomes, not so much for trade but for investment in particular for North Asian economies. And this really complicates the system that we're looking at. I do want to say to the audience that we are going to have some time at least for questions, and there are a number coming through now. Please put them through. We certainly won't be able to answer all of them. And I want to just have a final segment of discussion with the three of you, if we can, to look a bit at the future. We've already started doing this, but I probably do need to get really concise. Well, you've been very concise, but I need to get soundbite type answers, not napkin ones, of course, but for these sorts of things. But Deborah, I wanted to ask you, and you got into this when you mentioned the famous or infamous FIT-P, for which now a competition is open to define another name. We don't want to do another, CPTPP, which until recently was one of the most ridiculous names for a trade agreement, but there we are. Deborah, we've got to get over our brokenheartedness. We've got to cooperate. There's FIT-P, yes, but what about the World Trade Organization? Is that an avenue we should continue to be devoting attention to?
I mean, for sure, anything is better if we can have 166 or closer to 166 that participate. So the FIT-P, for example, is meant to be part of the WTO process. So these are countries, diverse countries working together, partly through the WTO, partly outside of that. But I don't think we can rely on only the WTO to solve our problems. Clearly, besides the United States being obstructionist, we have other countries that are less than helpful in the WTO context anyways. That combination, I think, is lethal in an organization that requires consensus. Getting through that logjam is going to be difficult. I would like to think that a crisis stimulates opportunity, and maybe we actually get some real movement out of the WTO. But when I listen to delegates in particular and countries talk about their WTO membership, they tend to divert back to whatever they were saying in 2024. And I'm not sure we're going to get there anytime soon. So I keep moving on the WTO, keep pushing, but that is a long-term challenge. In the meantime, I think shoring up alliances wherever you can, thinking about more creative solutions to trade problems. They don't have to be necessarily these big comprehensive free trade agreements like we used to do. Still do some of those, because those for businesses, they really do lower risk and they do increase certainty and they make it much more predictable and stable. But we can also be creative about coming up with new ways to solve specific problems, to solve problems that we anticipate in the future, where we don't really have trade rules and where we're just trying to collaboratively come up with what those might be. So I think, again, I know as depressing as the universe is, I'd like us to try to think about ways that we could leverage this to get better outcomes that are actually more fit for purpose as we move forward into 2026 and beyond.
Well, that's certainly the opportunity, isn't it, from the situation that we're finding ourselves in. Devon, turning to you, and speaking of alliances and gold standard agreements and comprehensive approaches and new arrangements, CPTPP, the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, is one of those type of initiatives. It's the infamous trade agreement, infamous for some, that was signed between 12 partners, often described as the gold standard. Is it the gold standard still? How can the CTPP members, if they are so minded, respond to the current situation? Bearing in mind, of course, that Australia is in the seat as chair this year of CPTPP.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, is the CPTPP a gold standard? I mean, yes and no. It was and is a very high ambition agreement in terms of the commitments and the rules, but it was signed in 2018 and a lot has changed since then. It's meant to be getting a review. By the end of the year, a report should be going to ministers. And so I think there is a lot that could be done under CPTPP to respond to the new operating environment we find ourselves in. Three things off the top of my head: get the review done and get those new ideas that Deborah was talking about. And we need to think outside the box. We can't just keep doing the same thing that we've been doing in the past. The second thing is fix the accession process. One by one just isn't cutting it, particularly if it takes 18 months and each country gets a bespoke process. And the third one is to really push forward with these dialogues with the European Union and with ASEAN to think about, well, what can we do between our blocks, between our groups of countries, even if it's not a full legally binding agreement. We need to have some joint leadership on these issues. As we were discussing before, there's a bit of a prisoner's dilemma almost, with everyone being split and divided between each other. The more we can get countries working together, I think we'll have a more solid foundation. And the other thing I wanted to mention on CPTPP is there's also RCEP, so the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is the ASEAN-centred agreement. That has been a bit quiet in most of the media for the last few years, but certainly in the Chinese media, in the Chinese space, it's getting a lot of attention, and within ASEAN. And last week's ASEAN economic ministers meetings in Malaysia saw a great statement from RCEP ministers, which sort of are showing there's going to be forward movement there on both the general review and accessions and stakeholder engagement. So if CPTPP doesn't sort of get its act together, I think that we'll be seeing some movement on the RCEP side of things. And then maybe the final point on both of these is that the positive thing about both CPTPP and RCEP is it shows that to some extent we can segment off the US issues, right? That the rest of the world can just keep pushing forward and keep moving forward with those rules and developing rules. It's not about ignoring or decoupling with the US, but recognizing that if we can show them that this system still works and these rules-based trade still work, then hopefully at some point in the far future, they'll return to it.
Yes, we've always got another acronym in the wings waiting to be brought out. RCEP, the largest trade agreement no one's ever heard about, is standing poised, ready to take up the challenge. Philip, and picking up on the point made by Devon, Japan's a member of CPTPP, South Korea is not, China wants to join it. All three are partners in RCEP, the world's largest trade agreement, as I said. Can we look to the north for solutions to the predicament we're in?
Thanks, Stephen. I think sort of, but not much in the short term. And that's principally because, as we've been saying, everyone right now is focused on trying to not provoke the United States and make things worse. That's your overriding domestic political priority in China, in Japan and Korea. And I think we just have to accept that. But behind the scenes and over the medium term, yes, I think Japan and Korea will certainly be looking to work with the likes of Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore on these sorts of new ideas. North Asia, of course, includes China, which is tricky. I mean, China talked a good game about the WTO, and we should definitely be working with China. And like others, I'd like to see us test the water on whether China can meet the test of membership of CPTPP. I'm a bit skeptical, but we should try. But as I said earlier, I also think China is part of the problem. Economic coercion, subsidies, dumping, these are significant issues. And China is as manipulative in some ways as anybody else. Like right now, China has been blocking imports of US soybeans all year. It's restricting rare earths, for example. These are examples of unannounced coercive measures. So we used to talk about the risk of a China-dominated regional economy. I think we're already there because of the United States shooting itself in the foot. But we should look, and we can look to Japan and Korea, I think, in the medium term and behind the scenes to work with others on innovative ideas. Current Prime Minister Ishiba in Japan had talked about innovative regional groupings on the security side. And I think there is a lot of interest in the officials in Seoul and Tokyo in whether there are innovative options available on the economic side as well. So I think nothing in the immediate term, but behind the scenes, yes, indeed, we should expect some support.
And of course, there is also the CPTPP EU dialogue, which has been proposed. So one of the things we're seeing is a lot of dynamic things starting up. I must admit, I'm finding this webinar far more uplifting than I thought it might have been. Not that I don't enjoy spending time with some of my best friends, but because we are seeing these little rays of sunshine poking through the rather dark clouds. But look, I want to give some time now to questions from the floor, and we've had a few of these coming through. We can't answer all of them, but the first one, which I'd like to direct to you, Deborah, what is the best case scenario for the future in the United States in the event that there is a change of government in the United States, bearing in mind that revenue streams from tariffs are very difficult to overcome? What's the best we can hope for, do you think?
Okay, so I'll try to make this short. There's a couple of things to watch if you're looking at US changes. So the first one is that a lot of these tariffs are under review now by the Supreme Court. The first hearing by the Supreme Court of the tariffs that were first announced in April, reciprocal tariffs, is November 5th, and a decision could be as soon as between now and June. So we will find out whether or not the authority that the US president has been using to impose a lot of these tariffs, and especially the ones that come fast and quick and that are completely, he argues, at his discretion, we will get a legal ruling on that very quickly. If those get overturned, that doesn't mean the end of tariffs. It just means the end of this particular tool for this particular purpose. And as a result of that, they've been rolling out a whole lot more of these, what are called Section 232s on sector-specific areas. Those you have to really watch, because it's not just the thing that they announced as a national security crisis, but potentially everything related to it. So the most classic example from this week is we have an ongoing lumber dispute, and now into lumber we have thrown kitchen cabinets, bathroom vanities, and upholstered furniture as part of lumber, all of which are supposed to actually start getting tariffs at very high levels as early as tomorrow. We're still waiting for the details on this, but it's coming up very fast. And so those kinds of tariffs are going to roll out. And I keep joking, for New Zealand in particular, that at some point we might start tariffing the things you eat, like nachos, as you sit on the couch watching whatever you're doing. And so all of a sudden, cheese ends up being part of a national security argument because you ate the cheese on the nachos sitting on the sofa, which is built of wood. I mean, that's where we're at. So I would expect continuing use of tariffs for novel approaches for different reasons to be announced at whim, basically, even in a end of a IEEPA tariff environment. Now, future administrations are still going to use tariffs, but I don't think they're going to use them quite so capriciously. I think this is a particular obsession of Donald Trump. If you have a different government, you will probably not use them in this manner. But to unwind any of the damage that the United States is causing to its reputation and its status is going to be difficult. Rebuilding trust is going to take, I'm assuming, the rest of my lifetime. I have no idea. I mean, maybe the Americans are much more savvy this time than I imagine, but it's going to be this is a long process of rebuilding. And we shouldn't think it's going to end soon. And finally, just to reiterate this about the 100th time, the man loves his tariffs. So expect him to keep threatening them at any moment, whenever, especially, he feels the spotlight is not on him or he feels threatened by something else. New tariff announcement. So just get ready for those kinds of things to continue, that steady drumbeat. And I would finally, the last thing I would just say is it's very easy in this environment to simply say, this is ridiculous, I'm going to quit paying attention. Like, I'm just going to climb under the covers. I'm going to eat my nachos on the couch. I'm not worried about this. Except that when you do that, you find yourself potentially getting really hammered because you weren't aware that this was about to happen to your sector, your industry, your job. And so, unfortunately, we all have to keep watching the Donald Trump train on tariffs because it's not going to go anywhere.
Mm. Reflecting on those comments, Devon, and this is another question from the floor, is it possible to decouple from the United States? I mean, can we send our bathroom vanity somewhere else? Is it a realistic proposition, and how important is it to keep the faith with that market and that great country?
Yeah, so I wouldn't think it's possible for most economies to decouple from the United States, certainly not for Australia. And I wouldn't even think it's desirable necessarily, right? So Australia has diversified export markets, so we can redirect exports where that's needed. But I don't think the aim should necessarily be decoupling as opposed to de-risking and diversifying. As I said earlier, it's important for the rest of the world to just keep going and just to keep doing what we can under rules-based trade, recognizing the special case to the US. But I don't think a deliberate strategy of decoupling is going to help anybody in this case.
Mm-hmm. Philip, is it possible, and again, this is a question that's come through, actually multiple questions have asked along these lines, is it possible to envisage a response that focuses more on, diversification, not in terms of markets, but in terms of products? Can we send different products to different places? Can we move from goods to services? Can we move everything online? What can we do in a diversification sense, in a product diversification sense, to respond to these sorts of challenges?
Yeah, great question, Stephen, and great question on the line. I mean, yes, that's obviously a highly desirable way to go. But look, having worked in business, these things are not easy to do. Not easy because one of the big elements in the current environment is uncertainty. And this is a problem for the United States. Mr. Trump wants more manufacturing and investment in the US, but the more he's acting capriciously on tariffs and investment policy, the more uncertain he's creating in the business environment, and the less likely, therefore, he is to see long-term investment deals into the United States. So the same problem applies to New Zealand or Australian exporters. Trying to find new products, new markets, this is what businesses do all the time. But it's hard to plan when the rules keep changing from day to day. So it's very, very demanding situation. Look, to put on the bright side, though, as a couple of others have said, I mean, I think it's encouraging that we have not seen retaliation to date against the United States, largely. And we have not seen countries kind of do the same thing, adopt Trumpian policies towards others. That's encouraging. So the most of the rest of the world is basically saying the United States is trying to fit. We think it's bad for them and bad for us. Let's try and limit their bad behavior, but carry on with the rules-based order that we think is good for us. I think that's a good sign. What hasn't happened so far is solidarity. Game theory would suggest the way to control a bully is that you get together, stick together, and eventually stand up to the bully. So far, because of individual national politics, we haven't been able to do that. But I think things like the whatever it is, these signs of international cooperation are encouraging. But for business, Stephen, to your question, there's little you can do in the short term. And I think that will have a chilling effect overall on trade and investment, no matter what happens next week or next month.
Look, I'm sorry we can't deal with the range of questions that we've had from our very engaged audience, but this has been, I hope you'll agree, a most interesting discussion between three really clued in and reflective commentators. In that song that we used as the sort of the catch to get everybody along today, What's Become of the Brokenhearted, there's a wonderful line that says, I know I've got to find some kind of peace of mind. Actually, it says some kind of peace of mind, baby, but that was the 60s. Some kind of peace of mind. I hope this discussion today will have provided some peace of mind to people who've been listening in, that there is a future ahead and that many sensible people are working on trying to find a way to get there, notwithstanding the challenges that we are facing. The good news is that there's a lot of thought going on around the world amongst government, businesses, other stakeholders about how to navigate this new world we find ourselves in. Certainly, I think Aotearoa New Zealand, with its history of innovative thinking on trade and in its unique ability to come up with new acronyms like Fitbit, what was it called again, Deborah? Is going to be part and parcel of that conversation. We're willing to make this contribution with our other partners in the region, especially our great friends in the Asia Pacific. We need to work with others in small groups and different configurations to really talk through the issues that confront us. I'm really grateful to my colleagues, Deborah, Philip, and Devon for joining us today from right around the Pacific, Te Moananui a for the roles that you are all playing individually in this exercise. Please look at Deborah's website at the Heinrich Foundation. Please follow Devon Whittle on social media. Please see also Philip Turner's commentary on social media and the things that he writes in different places. So we're going to bring this together now. Thank you very much, Sarah. No reira, kia koutou katoa, tēnā tātou katoa. Sarah, over to you.
Kia ora, Stephen, and thank you so much to you for arranging and leading this discussion today, and to Deborah, Devon and Philip for their really valuable insights from around the region and to the fragmented times we're living in, but also what we might do to act to secure our own futures. And I think that question of the different impacts that the tariffs are having on different countries and the way that that's making it challenging for us to coordinate action is a really valid one. But you've all provided examples of the way that countries are and can working together to make sure that we don't lose all of the gains we've made over the last 30 years in constructing this international system that's worked so well for us to now. So thank you to you all, and thank you to our audience for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. Please do provide your feedback, and we look forward to having you with us for more webinars over the next few weeks. Ka kite anō.
Mā te wā.
Kia ora. Kia ora.